Okay, I'm Matt Lassiter of the University of Michigan, and welcome to the panel, The State of the Field, U.S. Political History since 1945. We have a great lineup here. A lot of people in the audience could have been on this panel, so I apologize to you, but we have 5 great panelists as well. Assessing the state of the field in U.S. political history since the mid-20th century, and our prompt for the OAH was we are also evaluating the quest for new meta-narratives a quarter century after the appearance of the landmark anthology edited by Steve Fraser and Gary Gerstle, The Rise and Fall of the New Deal Order 1930 to 1980, which began with the pronouncement that with Ronald Reagan's election, an epoch in the nation's history had come to an end. The New Deal as a dominant order of ideas, public policies, and political alliances had died. In some ways, political history itself seemed dead in the 1980s, a marginalized subfield fixated on presidents and elections and top-down stories, and the action had moved to social and cultural history. Today, the new political history is a vibrant, more than a subfield, in dialogue with social and cultural history, or really social and cultural historians are doing the same kind of political history that political historians are doing, examining the grassroots through the methods of urban history, bringing the state back in through the multidisciplinary engagement with American political development, finding politics in the everyday interactions between bureaucrats and subjects, where the state encounters its citizens in multiple arenas, centering corporations and capitalism as subjects of historical inquiry, reconsidering the traditions of liberalism and conservatism, and much more. And the new political history is especially interested in the relationships among citizens, interest groups, social movements, governing institutions at all levels, both domestically and in foreign policy, and internationalizing U.S. history, a more expansive sense of the spheres where politics happen and the directions in which politics and power flow. And I'm going to read now the prompt that I gave the panelists, although I also told them that they can talk about anything that they want and they don't have to answer this question. But the historiographical fixation on political orders and massive epic shifts driven by electoral cycles is hard to shake, even though a lot of our stories tell alternative or complicated approaches as well. And scholars have interrogated the concept of the post-war liberal consensus and the New Deal order. New meta-narratives like the triumph of conservatism and the ascension of neoliberalism have emerged to capture the transformational shifts in American political culture and political economies since the 1970s, the sort of things that the contributors to the rise and fall of the New Deal order were living as they were writing about the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s in particular. Does modern American history operate along a red-blue divide? I have argued that it doesn't in many ways, and other people have contributed to that. Or have new forms of consensus supplanted the conditions of the post-war decades? How should we try to capture? What are the conceptual frameworks? What are the meta-narratives? What are the big historiographical questions that scholars have been working within and thinking through over the last decade or so, and that our panelists will suggest some new ideas for moving forward? So the goal is to debate competing frameworks or propose alternative conceptualizations, consider the cost and the benefits of the historiographical quest for synthesis, and meta-narrative at all. And so I asked people to stick to 8 to 10 minutes maximum so we can have contributions from the audience and have a conversation. And we're going to start with, I'm going to introduce the panelists one at a time and then let them speak because there's 5 of them. And so I'll introduce and then they'll go. Gary Gerstle will go first. Some of you may not know, but he is leaving the United States and moving to the University of Cambridge, where he'll be the Paul Mellon Professor of History starting in the fall. He's the Professor of History in the Department of History at Vanderbilt University. I'm not going to read the titles of all of his books and articles and everything because I want to have room for a discussion at the end. Starting with Working Class Americanism in 1989, the updated anthology with Steve Fraser, Ruling America. His latest book project is Governing America. He is the editor, one of the series editors of the Princeton University press series, Politics and Society in 20th Century America, which has contributed many of the important books in political history broadly defined. In 2014 is the 25th anniversary of the influential volume Rise and Fall of the New Deal Order. It's not, our panel is not about the book, but I did ask Gary, or invite Gary if he wanted to start with a few reflections on that volume and the interpretive frameworks that it posed, and what else is going on in its powerful aftermath. So Gary, you're up.
Thank you very much, Matt. Let me say there are quite a few seats up front for those people standing in the back. If you want to leave early, stay in the back, but if you want to sit, there are seats for all of you. I want to thank Matt for organizing this panel, and I can't believe it's been 25 years since The Rise and Fall of the New Deal Order was published, and I guess we'll know at the end of this panel whether the legacy still lives or whether we're here to perform a kind of historical autopsy. If the latter, I hope it's the beginning of a good wake. One thing I won't do today is proclaim the advent of a new political history, and that's simply because I've lived through too many new political histories, and so I think we should just ban the concept altogether. It's more useful as a marketing device and as a marker of serious intellectual progress and transformation. However, there is little doubt that political history is incomparably richer and more diverse as a field than it was in 1989 when the New Deal Order was published. And I have seen this both through all the work I have read and all the discussions about the New Deal Order, and also through having the privilege of co-editing the series Politics and Society in 20th Century America. I wrote out a whole series of comments in which I was going to list all the extraordinary ways in which political history has developed and been transformed in those last 25 years. And then I decided, let the other panelists do that work. That my greatest utility here is to offer you some reflections on the book itself and on whether it has continuing relevance. And I also want to address in particular one of Matt's charges to us, which is to think about the role of narrative and meta-narrative in writing recent American history. And I think that role remains incredibly important. The New Deal was an effort to tell such a story, and I think I want to argue today that the core concept that underlay the New Deal order is still quite relevant and useful in terms of helping us understand politics since 1945. To paraphrase Joan Scott, is a political order a useful category of historical analysis? And my answer to that is yes. By political order, Steve Fraser and I meant the linkages among economic elites, policymaking networks, and electoral constituencies that brought one party and its ideas political dominance for an extended period of time. We were reacting against other ways of writing political history. These other ways included an excessive influence of great men, mostly men, an excessive influence on 2-, 4-, and 6-year electoral cycles. We were reacting against Schlesinger's theory of a natural oscillation between liberalism and conservatism, a kind of natural motion that went every 20 years it would go one way and the next 20 years it would go the other. We were reacting against what we regarded as a simple-minded pluralism that, whatever we think of it here, is still extraordinarily popular in broader American politics and life. And that simple-minded pluralism goes like this, that any group could get what it wanted as long as it worked long and hard enough for it. This is the promise of American democracy. It's inscribed in this country's DNA. It's an idea that will never die. But our feeling was agency by itself is never enough. Rather, we began to think about American politics as being characterized by structures of power, patterns of electoral mobilization and belief that together comprised political orders. Steve and I were both labor historians at the time, which made us sensitive to underlying structures of economic power. We were both social historians, which impelled us to explore how the political consciousness of ordinary people took shape both from the bottom up and from the top down. And we were at the cusp of a revolution. For those of you who can remember back to 1989, which looks about like half the group here, we were at the cusp of a revolution in cultural history. Revolution hadn't quite happened yet, but talk about discourse, language, representation was already swirling around us. And thus the book's ambition became to expand our conception of the political to include economy, society, and culture. The concept of political order, we thought, might be able to carry that burden, and it's a tough and tall burden. To us, political order implied endurance. A political formation that arose one year and was gone the next could not be in order. The point of calling the New Deal in order was to argue that its influence extended far beyond the time that it formerly held sway. Only occasionally could political orders be effectively challenged, usually in times defined by economic crisis and or war. An economic crisis brought the New Deal order into being. Another economic crisis and a failed war, in this case Vietnam, brought it to its knees. These moments of crisis shook established beliefs, discredited governing parties, allowing new ideas, elites, constituencies, and movements to bid for power and for the chance to form a new political order. If we were onto something regarding political order, then it ought to be useful to analyze not just the New Deal in these terms, but the conservative turn that succeeded it. I believe that the concept of political order is useful to understand the conservative turn from the 1970s on. Indeed, this is how I interpret the remarkable outpouring of literature on conservatism these last 5 years. And I would say I discern the influence of the New Deal order in that conservative literature as much as I discern it in the literature on the 30s, 40s, and 50s itself. It is entirely possible, and I would say more than that, plausible, to think of a conservative order replacing a liberal order in the 1980s and lasting through 2008 and perhaps longer. Indeed, in the way this conservative order has been studied and analyzed, as I said before, I can discern the New Deal order's most lasting legacy. Just to give you an example of how order can exercise its influence, let me talk just for a moment, 30 seconds each, on Dwight Eisenhower and Bill Clinton, because I think they had similar historical roles in securing their own party's acquiescence to ideas that originated with the rival party, because it appeared to be the only way to succeed politically. Eisenhower brought the Republican Party aboard the New Deal, and Bill Clinton brought the Democratic Party aboard the conservative ascendancy when he declared that the age of big government was over, when he ended welfare as we knew it, when he decided to make his reputation as the law and order president of 1996. Here was evidence of the power that a political order could exert. The notion of an order is superior to the notion of consensus precisely because it does not require consensus. A political order is about power rather than agreement. It's about acquiescence rather than agreement. Even in its own ranks, a political order must hold together disparate groups in some kind of balance. One of the most important discoveries, interpretations of the rise and fall of the New Deal order was that a portion, and this appears in 3 different essays, maybe 4 different essays in the book, is that a portion of capital went over to the Democrats in the Great Depression years and went over to support FDR and the New Deal. This portion of capital, which I don't have time to define now, but we can certainly talk about it, provided crucial support, money, influence for FDR, and it made the Democratic Party at once the party of capital and the party of the common man. There were other uncomfortable alliances in this order. The Democratic Party was the party of the forgotten Americans, which included African Americans who left the party of Lincoln and flocked to the party of FDR in the 30s, but it was also, of course, the party of white supremacy. These divisions required work, reform, denial, compromise, buyouts, sellouts, and when all else failed, invocation of some kind of transcendent belief. They could be dangerous, these divisions, and in times of crisis, these divisions would become the fault lines along which political orders would crack. What critiques, if I'm arguing for the continued utility of the concept of political order, what critiques might we apply? The most obvious one is that it's simply too rigid. American politics is much more fluid and contingent and pluralistic. And it's a legitimate argument, but I just think it's wrong. I'm no more persuaded of it today than I was 25 years ago. A second critique is that this notion of political order underestimates the embeddedness of past policies, or what social scientists call, in a very important theory, but an absolutely awful phrase, path dependency. Path dependency means that decisions made in the past structure possibilities for the future, and once a series of policies are in place, sometimes no matter how unpopular they are either impossible to remove or to reform. And so even when a new political order arises, that political order is sometimes limited in what it can do because other programs are up and running. If we think of the GOP's efforts to privatize Social Security and their failure to do so, we can understand it in this regard. In 1986, there was a major effort by Reagan and the head of the Civil Rights Commission to just eliminate all the counting by race, which by then had spread to every institution in the country that was getting federal contracts, so 74,000 employers. And there was an uproar against it, not just from the civil rights community, but from the corporate community and all aspects of American life. As we talk about the Obama health care plan constantly and wondering whether it's going to succeed or fail, remember that the public option was never on the table, and that we can say the public option for this round of health care reform was foreclosed in 1992, 1993, 1994. Another example of past decisions foreclosing future possibilities. And this idea of embeddedness speaks to a kind of autonomy for the American state, both in its original design and through administrative embeddedness. And we can also understand the frustration of a would-be political order such as the GOP political order today, and feeling like it is dominant in all respects but just can't move the machinery in government the way it feels it ought to be able to. And I think this helps us understand the extreme radicalization of the Republican Party in the last few years. Finally, one should not always assume that a new political order always succeeds a failed one. That's way too functionalist a notion for understanding political or any other kind of history. We must allow for interregnums, which is one way of describing our own current moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. So, the next panelist is George Sanchez, Department of History and American Studies and Ethnicity, and also the Vice Dean for Diversity and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Southern California. One of the reasons I invited George to participate in this panel is it's important to note George is a series editor for the American Crossroads New Works in Ethnic Studies series at the University of California Press. And while a different center of gravity in this country in terms of political history, a lot of incredibly important work has come out of the University of California, and more of an Omi and Winant, racial formation, multi-ethnic, multiracial approaches, and there's been a lot of convergence. And George doesn't have to talk about that. He can talk about whatever he wants. I should mention he's the author of the wonderful book, Becoming Mexican American, Ethnicity, Culture, and Identity in Chicano, Los Angeles in 1993. His new project is called Bridging Borders, Remaking Community, Racial Interaction in Boyle Heights, California in the 20th Century. So, George, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. I want to thank Matt for asking me to be on this panel and giving me the opportunity to think about the field of recent political history. My comments are entitled Post-45 Political History from Chicano Eyes Looking Out from the Hollywood Sign. So you see that they're both idiosyncratic and very specific. 2 weeks ago, I saw the most important Chicano-oriented political film produced in a generation in a mostly empty theater in New York City, the new biopic called Cesar Chavez. As I sat there, both happy that something of this story had finally made it to the screen, thank God for capital and perseverance from Mexico, and sad that so many complicated aspects of Chavez's life had been shortened or left out, the critical role of Filipino workers in the disastrous period after the end of the narrative of the film in the late 1970s, so powerfully told by historian Matt Garcia in his latest book. I also worried that new stereotypes of Mexican Americans in the late 20th century as a primarily rural people were being left for a new generation. Mexican Americans by the 1960s were the most urbanized people in the U.S., despite the decision by Cesar Chavez, first living in San Jose and then trained in Los Angeles, to organize farm workers as the most visible part of his community to the rest of U.S. society. The film tells us much about what has and hasn't changed in Hollywood depictions of Latino political life in the United States, but also that most of the stories we now know from our own sense of the past are unlikely to get the big screen treatment anytime soon. However, a new generation of historians has been toiling away to tell new stories and historical monographs and articles that challenge older assumptions about Chicano political history in the context of political life in outposts out west, where the world is less black and white, both literally and metaphorically. I'd like to break down my short insights into these developments into three post-45 eras: the Cold War coalitions, multiracial coalitions of urban Mexican Americans, the literature challenging nationalist renderings of the Chicano civil rights movement, and the post-1970s neoliberal political frameworks of the state and its response by immigrant activists. Historians have begun to reassess Cold War politics in ways that challenge earlier depictions of a largely docile ethnic middle class cowed towards assimilative postures and de-radicalized politics because of McCarthyite attacks on leftists. Instead, this work largely on California urban politics has stressed the move towards powerful multiracial coalitions forming in the late 1940s and 50s between various groups to turn local politics towards progressive urban politics. From the work of Shauna Bernstein, Allison Varsali, and Mark Brilliant, we have learned that these coalitions held together despite the anti-left crusades to effectively move California politics in a new direction of liberalism by the late 1950s, enacting civil rights reform in California that would directly spawn the new activism of the 1960s. Unlike the activism coming from Atlanta and the South in the same period, this civil rights agenda would be driven by Jews and Chicanos, Asian Americans and blacks in coordinated ways. Scott Kuroshige's work shows how Japanese Americans and African Americans worked together after World War II to avoid ethnic competition and instead lead efforts to racial reconciliation and new urban possibilities in the Little Tokyo Bronzeville section of downtown Los Angeles. On a more pessimistic note, Daniel Hosang has shown how the coalition that came together to fight the push to enshrine housing discrimination into the California Constitution as private property rights in 1964 gave up too much of the discursive terrain to the right, which subsequently led to the triumph of reactive forces brought in by the Reagan Revolution in California in destroying anti-discrimination efforts, labor rights, and progressive taxing strategies by the state. And I've written on the multiracial coalition that formed behind Edward Roybal and the Community Services Organization in Boyle Heights that would eventually prove to be a home for the training of Cesar Chavez himself. I recently had the pleasure of reading upcoming work by historian Max Krochmal from Texas Christian University that shows much of the same multiracial coalitions forming during this period in Houston and San Antonio. This coalition of Mexican-American activists, black clergy and other civil rights activists, and white union activists came together in powerful ways by the late 1950s to lay the groundwork for progressive politics in Texas in the era we've largely known as Lyndon Johnson's, largely unrecognized until our own current moment in hoping for a blue post-Bush, post-Rick Perry period in Texas politics. Much of the innovative work on the period of the Chicano movement in both Texas and California focuses now on the continuities between these Cold War coalitions and Chicano activism of the late 1960s and 70s. Lorena Oropeza's work on the anti-Vietnam War movement among Chicanos in California makes connections to earlier periods of progressive politics and militarism of earlier generations of Mexican-American servicemen and veterans. David Montejano's look at the Chicano movement coming of age among youth in San Antonio makes vital connections to the earlier politics of the Mexican-American middle class and centrist Henry B. Gonzalez, taken in new directions as the 1960s unfolded. Earlier attempts to suggest a strong break from the 1950s no longer work well to understand the unfolding of the more boisterous politics of the movimiento. On the other hand, new directions did emerge out of youth organizations like Campus Mechas, according to the stunning feminist work of Maylee Blackwell in Chicana Power. According to Blackwell, the feminist gatherings that took place inside of Chicano student organizations often had profound repercussions for for the training and empowerment of new groups of women new to college and away from families that would have long-term implications for the direction of Chicana feminist politics, as well as the direction of the overall women's movement and social movements of the Mexican-American population for years to come. Many other authors, from Marisa Chavez to Abigail Rosas, are changing the ways we understand the relationship between these powerful political and social forces at their heights in the 1970s. I would characterize the third era of the post-45 political history of Chicanos and others in the West to be developing with new understandings of the rise of a post-industrial neoliberal political order that has profound implications for understanding the dynamics of politics and the nation state in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Books such as Ruthie Gilmore's Golden Gulag about the rise of the carceral state in California make clear not only that conservatism has reshaped the hopes of the liberal left political movement coming out of the 1960s, it also indicates that new configurations of transnational capital have reshaped the political landscape of our era, creating new social and political realities and a politics not easily bounded by a single nation state. Indeed, we might call this a transition from the New Deal order to the New World Order. While others on the panel may discuss other aspects of this turn in political history, I would focus on what might be emerging as a new political history of the undocumented, especially the Dreamer movement in the immigrant political landscape. Historians Ana Miñán and Ana Rosas have created important histories that contextualize the history of the undocumented in the US for the very first time, one concentrating on transnational organizational life and the other on intimate relationships within families and couples. In many ways, these studies are precursors to our own era in which individual members of families have been increasingly willing to speak up for their collective rights in public forums, even when the US state does not recognize them as official political actors. I believe we will see the 2006 immigrant marches across the US as a major historical turning point for our own era, while the continued efforts of the Dreamer effort to secure legislation and the rights of national citizenship points to the importance of political standing in shaping the social world we have created. This movement, like the others I've discussed, pushes at the current boundaries of US political history and asks us historians to better contextualize the worlds between the social world and the political order to understand modern US society. Thank you.
So just to mark, without editorial comment, a little bit of the friction that we're all debating. There is a difference between talking about the post-1970s conservative turn and conservative order and talking about the neoliberal turn and the New World Order. Of course, they overlap, but as we're thinking about conceptual frameworks, talking about neoliberalism and capitalism and globalization is a good way to introduce Bethany Morton. Bethany Morton of the Department of History and Women's Studies at the University of Georgia, author of the fantastic book To Serve God in Walmart, The Making of Christian Free Enterprise. She is also a series editor at Columbia University Press's Studies in the History of U.S. Capitalism. And Bethany, you're up.
Thank you so much, Matt. When Matt actually invited me to do this, for maybe the first time in my life, I was on my email when it came in, and I answered immediately because I thought he might rethink the invitation and decide I had no business whatsoever up here. So if you're thinking that, you are in good company. But I appreciated this attempt to write me into this conversation, so I didn't want to waste it, nor do I want to waste your time. I took my task here today to be bringing in a quick overview, perhaps, of the impact of renewed historical interest in political economy that sometimes performs under the drag name History of Capitalism. I'll quickly then touch on the history of the term, and in order to draw attention to the truly artificial divide that has been imposed between both halves of that larger term, and then look at several arenas in which its resurgence has been productive through general categories such as globalization, financialization, and if time permits, a little bit on state building and institutions in the context of empire. The trend for the revivification of political economy, I think, has been in evidence for well over a decade. If you start from perhaps Liz Cohen's work and Meg Jacobs' Pocketbook Politics, Robin Einhorn's American Taxation, American Slavery, just to see kind of the range of topics that have been revisited with a really explicit eye to political economy through perhaps the best way to periodize intellectual development, these benchmark multi-author collections like the Zelizer, Novak, and Jacobs Democratic Experiment, the JAH special issue on conservatism in 2011, and the work in Julian Zelizer and Kim Phillips Fine's 2012 collection, What's Good for Business. A sampling of the most recent work, then, could include the books on business lobbying and economic ideology by Benjamin Waterhouse, Ellie Shermer, Angus Bergen, Nathan Connolly's forthcoming A World More Concrete, and further explorations into the energy sector's tangled connection to politics in research that's underway by Darren Dochuk, if people have seen a sample of that, Betsy Beasley, these are now dissertations I'm talking about, Gavin Benke. So this stretches a good long arc and is bringing a number of different concerns under the tent of political economy. In short, political economy is at the center of political history for some of the field's most influential thinkers, and that influence, I think, can now be seen in graduate programs around the country. And speaking as someone who actually was explicitly inspired by the rise and fall of the New Deal order, I know several of the authors are in the room, and I had a copy with little horns drawn onto Reagan's face on the cover. That was a benchmark for many of us as a starting point, exactly as you say, Gary, for studies of conservatism. So with those kinds of collections marking this development, then my own dog in this fight actually is attempting to remove this artificial divide between these soft social issues and these hard economic issues that I think still perseveres in some of our political analysis. And I want to just enter that by a quick tour of the divorce between the two sides of that term, political economy. As everyone is no doubt aware, the term develops in the 18th century as a branch of moral philosophy that raised the study of domestic economy, the governance of the home, to the level of the new polities, the developing nation states as well as the expanding empires. The emerging field amply demonstrated its foundation in the home and its context of empire right from the start, and I think this is what we've kind of lost track of. The first professor of political economy in the English-speaking world was Robert Malthus, Pop Malthus, short for population, apparently, whose vision of an apocalypse of unrestrained reproduction by the poor remains a remarkably fresh political debate in this exact instant. Moreover, he argued against poor relief from his professorship at the East India Company College, which trained administrators for its patron until the Indian Uprising of 1857 prompted Great Britain to move governance of its empire from a corporation and its private security forces to a polity and its army. So this intellectual wing of analysis develops within this context and takes explicit account of all these parts. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that the argument for divorcing the two halves of the term actually gained traction, particularly through Alfred Marshall's influential 1890 textbook, The Principles of Economics, which can take a lot of credit for raising the term of economics to the status of a math-based and behavioral science from its original home in historical and moral sciences. At the same time, it helped write the Victorian separate spheres distinction between market and non-market labor into the new science, sacralizing female self-abnegation as an off-the-books input to the national bottom line. The most valuable of all capital is that invested in human beings, wrote Marshall, and of that capital, the most precious part is the result of the care and influence of the mother, so long as she retains her tender and unselfish instincts and has not been hardened by the strain and stress of unfeminine work. So the move to take economics out of its political context and out of its basis in the home and governance and power within that home has been a depoliticization of economics. And so this recent move in political history to insist on the centrality of political economy to the analysis across the field is very welcome and certainly has precedent. It's not brand new, but I think it does have a higher profile now than it has had for several decades. This concerted intellectual labor then succeeded in breaking the two concepts apart so that economics freed itself from the necessity of accounting for power relations. So one wing of recent historiography then has been engaged in the broad project of reconciling the parties in the Great Divorce between the two halves of political economy. And for me, the most useful of those contributions has been the portion that also recenters the sexual and racial contracts that underwrote political economy in the first place. In the era in which the state, the market, and the home are playing hot potato with the necessary burdens of social reproduction and the costs of economic activity, their mutual interdependence becomes strikingly available for historical analysis. Given that our historical questions are formed in part by contemporary concerns, of course, one reason that political economy has become more reliably visible in political history has been the steady drumbeat of globalization talk dating back a generation. Actually, I plotted the engram, and it's virtually a flat line, and then it goes almost to 90 degrees in the mid-'80s, as you would imagine. So we've been talking globalization to the point that it has ceased to really mean much of anything, but it does get us to some of the more theoretical concerns. In order to hold any meaning, this overworked term must be considered in its mutually constitutive effects on both economy and polity, characterized by the space that was opened up between the two when production was deterritorialized, as many of you here have theorized, but formal political sovereignty remained roughly where the Treaty of Westphalia had left it, firmly tied to national borders and national subjects. Rather than seeing the end of the nation state, globalization created new and powerful uses for the bounded sovereignty by hollowing out many state structures while retaining the cloak of their legitimacy. So I'm arguing that we're functioning, we're running our analyses in a moment in which the political reality that is still grounded in nation states has not caught up with the economic reality that has been so energetically freed from that skeleton. And much non-historical analysis takes place in exactly that space that we can learn so much from. One useful outgrowth of globalization's ubiquity has been the increased attention to economic policy as a tool of international influence on par with, or perhaps even more significant than, military intervention or formal foreign policy. So when Schaeffer is opening up its ranks to analyses of modernization and development, we are in a happy moment for foreign relations as a wing of political history. While Emily Rosenberg's Spreading the American Dream originally mapped some of this territory in 1982, and the arguments over modernization have been central to other disciplines and other geographical subfields in history, U.S. attention to economic development as an arm of policy and as an agent of empire has flourished recently in books like David Ekblad's The Great American Mission, Modernization and the Construction of an American World Order, Michael E. Latham's The Right Kind of Revolution, Modernization, Development, and U.S. Foreign Policy, and Jennifer Van Vleck's Empire of the Air, Nick Cullither's The Hungry World, America's Cold War Battle Against Poverty in Asia. So by finally adopting these tools from these other subfields and other disciplines, geographical areas of history, we're actually seriously enriching the study of American political foreign policy. Multinational corporations, as we have had occasion to note, also play a role in historical accounts seeking to reunify politics and economy as creatures of domestic law and public subsidy, protected abroad by national armies and supranational legal regimes. U.S. MNCs, multinational corporations, wrote geographer Neil Smith, quote, led with trade, financial, and direct investment agreements, while governmental involvement increasingly focused on providing broad legal and policy conditions. It's impossible to imagine American foreign policy without these allegedly non-state actors at the center of them. Finally, historical interest in the 20th century globalization of agriculture and production, again, so thoroughly documented and theorized by too many of you in here to mention, has been joined more recently by concern with their flashier and more mysterious cousins in finance. With the financial sector surpassing manufacturing and services at the end of the 20th century, much historical talent has begun to focus on this most ethereal branch of the economy up and down the entire traditional range of actors for political history. At the level of high policy, Greta Krippner's essential Capitalizing on Crisis, the political origins of the rise of finance, traces the sometimes ad hoc decisions of economic policymakers in Washington, who largely freed the financial sector from governance in the 1970s and 80s, while adding other economic power brokers to the cast of characters, both books like Jeff Cowie's and Judith Stein's likewise bring us directly into White House-directed economic policy, analyzing some of the same terrain, but with a much richer cast of characters. If anything, they come off even worse in these treatments, the policymakers. In short, the deterritorialization of capital that emerges in these stories and others arguably marks a shift of gravity from corporations to markets themselves as key institutions organizing our lives. With the space of decision-making now so often divorced from the space of identity, the nation-state again lagging behind these financial centers as where we organize our political reality. I think this is a vein that is ripe for continued mining. Sean Wilentz, summing up political historiographies since the Turner thesis back in 2007, said, quote, "My guess is that political history will advance fastest and farthest where the scholarly grudges, methodological obsessions, and political intrusions that have always haunted professional history can most quickly be put aside, and where the labels that have now become professional identifiers can be most safely ignored." And I hope I'm not alone in wishing that for the good of the field and for the good of our students themselves. Thank you.
Bethany's remarks remind us of her important assault on Thomas Frank's separation of the social and the economic and what's the matter with Kansas. And that's a good way to transition to Marissa Chappell. Marissa Chappell of the Department of History at Oregon State University. She's the author of The War on Welfare, Family, Poverty, and Politics in Modern America, 2009, and in the Penn series, Politics and Culture in Modern America, which has, of course, produced many outstanding works in political history. I'll say one thing about Marissa's book, because she won't say it probably herself. It is a very important critique of the idea that liberalism abandoned class politics in the 1970s. She, in effect, argues that liberals were obsessed with class politics, and it was their cultural conservatism on gender and sexuality and their inability to get out of the normative breadwinner frame that actually helped bring about some of the policy changes that other scholars have attributed more to the disappearance of class and the kind of confluence of class and race. And when you center gender and sexuality, you don't necessarily get the declension narrative about the New Deal order that you get when you center class and to an extent race. And that's not trumping what you're going to say, Marissa. More of an invitation. Thank you for joining us. Let me just say about her new project. It's about community organizing and grassroots campaigns for economic justice after the 1960s, uncovering a hidden history of progressive activism in an era noted for conservative political realignment, and looking at racial and class politics that have shaped the grassroots political left. Now you're up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including me on this panel. It's really an honor. The rise and fall of the New Deal order debuted in 1989. The Academy had only recently recognized women's history as a legitimate field of study, and it had been just 3 years since Joan Scott made her case for gender as a useful category of historical analysis. So perhaps it's not surprising that outside of Elaine Tyler May's essay, women and gender are largely absent from the volume. Of the 7 index entries for women, 6 are from May's essay. Feminism ranks 1 reference. Fast forward 25 years. Scholarship on women, gender, and sexuality has exploded. It has reshaped the way many of us define political history and changed our understanding of key political trends and events. But I would argue that with some important exceptions, the robust scholarship in these areas too often remains separate, categorized as women's history, gender history, history of sexuality, welfare history. The insights of these fields have yet to penetrate fully the broader narrative of modern American political history. And that's in contrast, for example, to the way that those fields have really reshaped our narrative of progressive era politics. I'd like to mention 4 of those insights and discuss how they perhaps qualify some aspects of a rise and fall narrative and enrich our understanding of political history and political change. First, scholarship on women, gender, and sexuality has illuminated significant limitations to the New Deal order's social democratic character. Historians have long debated when and why the most expansive promises of the 1930s liberal left eroded. But as Linda Gordon, Alice Kessler Harris, Sonia Michel, Gretchen Ritter, Gwendolyn Mink, and many others have shown the New Deal's very design, rooted not only in systems of racial inequality, but also in conservative gender and sexual politics, compromised its social democratic promise from the beginning, creating what Eileen Boris has called a racialized gendered state. While Margot Canaday, David Johnson, and Mark Stein have illuminated how profoundly heterosexual norms shaped social citizenship and liberal policymaking at the height of the New Deal order. Second, attention to women reveals that the social democratic impulse did not disappear in the 1940s. This is similar to George's point about attention to Chicano and other multiracial organizing. To be sure, historians have convincingly argued that liberal policymakers embraced Keynesian growth strategies, that a rhetoric of pluralism and racial liberalism at the height of post-war anti-communism muted class politics, that business elites successfully blocked robust regulatory and redistributive policies, that elements of organized labor embraced interest group politics, and in a really exciting, I think, new kind of literature, that white urban and suburban residents developed a powerful language of individualism and taxpayer rights that proved a formidable political break on some forms of social provision and regulation. Yet a large number of works have identified a vibrant left politics among African Americans in the post-war years, and the work that George Sanchez mentions on multiracial coalitions. Attention to women's activism, especially, I think, demonstrates that the social democratic impulse remained vital in these years, and certainly challenges any notion that the New Deal social democratic impulse was an aberration in an otherwise profoundly individualistic society, as Nick Salvatore and Jefferson Cowie have argued. Robin Muncie, Susan Lynn, Adam Rome, Sylvie Murray, and Lily Geismer have discovered significant progressive political activism among post-war urban and suburban white women. Dorothy Sue Cobble, Dennis DeSlippe, Landon Storrs, Natalie Fosikas, and many others have shown that working class women protested the post-war retreat from publicly funded childcare, pressed unions to demand maternity and equal pay clauses, and demanded various public regulatory and redistributive policies. Christina Green, Tiffany Gill, Robert Korstad, Dio Gore, and others have shown that black women largely built the community infrastructure that would become the foundation for the mass civil rights organizing in the South, while Danielle McGuire has revealed the importance of sexual politics to civil rights mobilization. And Rhonda Williams, Lisa Levenstein, Annalise Orlick, Jane Theoharis, Laura McEnany, and others have discovered that working class African American women made demands of urban public institutions in what Lisa Levenstein has called a movement without marches. Throughout the post-war era then, women pushed at the boundaries of liberal reformism, demanding expansive social provision and challenging the New Deal order's limits. Third, attention to women and gender has reshaped our understanding of conservative mobilization in at least two key ways. Lisa McGurr, Michelle Nickerson, Mary Brennan, Catherine Rimpf, and others have convincingly placed women at the center of grassroots conservative mobilization. Other scholars are challenging any distinction, as Bethany Morton discussed, between free market or economic conservatism and traditionalist or social conservatism. For example, Bethany Morton and Natasha Zaretsky convincingly argue that anxieties about gender and sexuality profoundly shaped reactions to post-industrial transformation and were central to the liberal political crisis and to the growth of a powerful strain of free market ideology. Finally, attention to the political work of women as well as gay and working class men challenges prevailing understandings of the fall of the New Deal order. Scholars continue to debate the reasons for and the extent of and the nature of the transformation in American politics and political economy in the last third of the 20th century. Recent work has illuminated corporate mobilization, misguided liberal policymaking, and both elite and grassroots construction of an influential colorblind conservatism or homeowner politics or political whiteness as key factors. And a growing body of recent scholarship is questioning the nature of the right turn narrative in a couple of key ways. First of all, pointing to the institutionalization of liberal precepts and policies, like Gareth Davies' work on education policy. Second, by recognizing broad popular consensus around Social Security and other elements of the liberal state. And third, by uncovering flourishing left-of-center local activism and creative left liberal coalition and policymaking into the 1980s and beyond. Michael Stewart Foley's work and lots of papers here at this conference, including forthcoming work from Josh Mound and Austin McCoy. But the backlash interpretation that dominated in the 1980s has been remarkably persistent. In this overdetermined narrative, feminists, along with gay liberationists and black and brown power activists, conspired with their liberal allies to pursue a narrow identity politics that undermined the interests of the working class and killed the common dreams on which the New Deal order supposedly depended. Recent interpretations from Nelson Lichtenstein and Jeffrey Bloodworth, for example, tend to characterize feminist activism as distinct from and even destructive of class solidarity and economic justice. Jefferson Cowie in Staying Alive, Bruce Miroff and G. William Domhoff, all of whom offer numerous useful insights, portray feminism as a form of post-materialist liberalism, relegating issues of gender and sexuality to the realm of the presumably less important social or cultural issues, and characterizing the working class as white and male. Broader histories of the American left from Michael Kazin and Doug Rossinow treat the new left as the left, the post-1960s left, and argue that its fragmentation and demise represented the end of a viable left political voice. Scholarship on women's politics, not to mention the burgeoning fields of Chicano studies and Black Power studies, challenges these assumptions. Nancy McLean, Susan Hartman, and Serena Mayeri, among many others, have demonstrated the centrality of economic distribution to feminist politics. Felicia Kornblue, Eileen Boris and Jennifer Klein, Pramila Nadeson, Kathleen Cole, Kimberly Springer, Tamar Carroll, and I could go on and on, have uncovered widespread mobilization among working class white women and women of color in the late 20th century, women for whom class, race, and gender could hardly be untangled, and who insisted on the necessity of both recognition and redistribution. That these movements failed to counter the rise of economic inequality should not lead us to ignore, discount, or mischaracterize their efforts. Without continued attention to continual contest over the role of the state, redistributive policies, and political economy, a narrative of conservative ascendancy is impoverished and, I'd argue, simply unexplainable. Given the prominence of women in what Dorothy Sue Cobble has called the new working class majority of low-wage service workers, and among new immigrants who, as George Sanchez pointed out, whose influence on politics has been great and yet has yet to be deeply analyzed, and given discernible gender gaps in Americans' political and policy preferences, we can no longer afford a limited definition of the working class or of class politics, nor can we afford to overlook the relevance of gender and sexuality in shaping modern American politics. Thank you.
All right, now it's really getting good. Thanks, thanks, Marissa. The idea for this roundtable came out of a great workshop that Marissa did at the University of Michigan about the search for new meta-narratives in the 1970s with some of our grad students there too. And speaking of the 1970s, that's a good way to introduce Suleiman Osman, Department of American Studies at George Washington University. He's the author of The Invention of Brownstone Brooklyn, Gentrification and the Search for Authenticity in Post-War New York, the 2011 book. And just a quick comment, we often forget, because it seems such common sense now, that one of the important insights of the rise and fall of the New Deal order is it started talking about things that happened in the late 30s and early 1940s instead of saying everything changed in the 1960s because of polarization and Keynesian economics and everything else. Well, we're all, of course, trying to figure out what happened in the 1970s. And there's a lot of flourishing work. Suleiman's new book project is about urban politics and culture in the 1970s. He's very closely associated with what you might call the spatial turn in political history, which is another way of saying doing social history in neighborhoods and local places, but thinking about the state and thinking about the big questions, which social historians, of course, have always done as well. And cultural history and identity are all over that as well. So you're up.
Well, I'm very excited to be following such an esteemed panel. And since I'm going last, I decided that maybe in terms of the call to talk about meta-narratives, I'll be a little bit meta and sort of talk more generally about some of the ideas that were here and propose. Okay. And propose perhaps a different spatial way of looking at the rise and fall of the New Deal order. How does inserting space into the story perhaps offer a way to interpret or make sense or offer a way of dealing with the transition of the 1970s. And I agree with Matt Lassiter's call for rethinking the rise and fall narrative and to look at the 70s, and this is beginning with Bruce Schulman's work, as a moment of transition between the 60s and 80s, and maybe look for a way to challenge or at least not accept existing categories. And I want to start by bringing up an interesting political figure, one who's often mentioned in Urban History Association conferences, practically every panel, but perhaps doesn't fit into existing categories of political history, and that's Jane Jacobs. Certainly most of us have heard of the Greenwich Village activist, author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, her fight to defend Greenwich Village against urban renewal, in particular plans to put a roadway through Washington Square Park, and that Jacobs taking on New York City's growth machine, the most famous member being Robert Moses, attacking the fundamental ideas of post-war modern urban planning, the profession of planning itself, and this dichotomy of Jane Jacobs versus Robert Moses, which is so familiar to, if you're from New York, New Yorkers, but also familiar in urban history. How does it fit exactly into the historiography in political history? Who is on the left? Who is on the right? Who's the liberal? Who's the anti-liberal? How do you make sense of Jane Jacobs? Jacobs was not alone. Neighborhoods like Jacobs' Greenwich Village and then later Toronto's The Annex were epicenters of local activism in the 60s and in the 70s, particularly focused on fighting urban redevelopment, expressways, the placement of waste facilities, power plants, methadone clinics, expansion of hospitals and universities. Many of the activists, the urban Chicano activists mentioned by George Sanchez or in Boyle Heights, are similarly fighting development. And elsewhere I've called this a neighborhood movement, a community movement, a citizens movement. You could call it a global or a slow growth movement. I've even looked at places like Amsterdam, it's global as well. And this kind of language of the 70s, decentralization, local autonomy, devolution of power to local communities, participatory democracy, that seems to infuse language both on the grassroots, left, right. It doesn't really fit necessarily into the existing frameworks. So how do you make sense of, let's say, the battle against airport expansion? Jane Jacobs, there's an array of protests against airports, hundreds from Burbank to Newburgh to Logan in the 60s and 70s. How do Jacobs linked her anti-expressway activism to anti-war activism. In East Boston, anti-Logan Airport protests were linked to the anti-busing movement, and so there was a critique of Massport and busing. Other anti-expressway movements were linked to Black Power and other sort of ethnic power. In Montreal, the Montreal Citizens Movement had interesting links to language separatism, as well as sort of upper middle class early gentrification. So there are really four meta-narratives or declension narratives of the fall of the New Deal order. And like all paradigms, I think they work. They have their explanatory strengths. That's why we have them. And so I don't think they should be abandoned, I agree. But they have their limits, like all paradigms, things they don't explain, people that don't fit, who we explain away as outliers, or sometimes when confronted with inexplainable bedfellows, we use that historian's escape hatch, co-optation. So the people who do politics we like are doing it right, and the people who we don't are co-opting it, the people who are doing it right. So what are these four quickly in few minutes the four major interpretations of the decline. These mini decline within the fall of the New Deal order are four declension narratives. And I said this was going to be meta, so it's big. The first interpretation is that of a shift from whole to fragmented, to shattered, from consensus to conflict, from the integration of the early civil rights movement to the multicultural and identity movements of the 70s and 80s. The universal goals of the social democratic state giving way to the balkanized demands of myopic identity politics, the racial anger of the white working class, the inward self-absorption of the white counterculture. It's obviously a declension narrative. That the project, the New Deal order, is shattered, disaggregated. This, of course, it's powerful, but it has its limits. It's normative. It rests on the idea that there was once something whole that was intact and that is now incomplete. And the sort of what is whole, these are things that conceptually are hard to make sense of what is whole and what is not. The second major, and there's more to this, the second major interpretation places errors on a spectrum. The oscillation that Gary Gerstle mentioned, a pendulum which politics shifts either to the left or the right. The growing literature on the rise of the conservative movement, and that the end of the New Deal order was in fact a shift to the right, and the texts were already mentioned, or counter arguments that in fact there was a hidden, or that there's stories of a shift to the left, and that really it's a divergence from the center, which of course has all sorts of, which is powerful and explains a lot, but also has its frustrating limits. The idea that there used to be a center, in this case liberalism as being the center, and that a lot of movements of the 1970s don't fit into this framework cleanly. How do you categorize, or how do you make sense of the populist conservative, almost the left libertarian, anti-status, anti-corporate impulses of Jane Jacobs and some of these neighborhood movements? Let's say, the historic preservation movement in cities in the 70s. Is that a shift to the left or a shift to the right? Are festival marketplaces in the late 70s a shift to the left or to the right? Is the devolution of housing policy to community development corporations in the 70s a shift to the left or the right? These are all sort of difficult to figure out. Other movements that don't fit neatly into this, the environmentalist movement, of course, or the women's movement. Do we need to perhaps not rest easily on familiar dichotomies? The third major paradigm, I'd say, is one that the fall of the New Deal order was a shift in affect. That rather than political shifts, people can point to mood swings. That historical eras are shifts in emotions or the affect of citizens, from hope to rage, to malaise, to anxiety. In this sense, the historian acts as therapist. This, of course, I think is methodologically hard in the sense of how do you measure and categorize mood. A lot of these terms, of course, if you talk about affect, are terms that need to be unpacked. What is anger? These are things that affect your, and then also it tends to follow the life cycle of college-educated white baby boomers, from the youthful innocence of the 50s to the hope of the 60s to disillusionment in the 70s to materialistic yuppie-dub in the 40s, in the 80s. And you want to get a sense of reading the sort of euphoria of many groups in the 70s in cities. You think of the excitement of African Americans electing the first black mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson, or perhaps even the euphoria of being born again if you're, Christian evangelism. But I think the mood could be hard to. There's another fourth, which is not necessarily a declension narrative, but I think is a declension narrative in some ways. And that's the one that looks at either the 68 or 1973 oil crisis as being a shift from pre to post. That the 70s is the beginning of a series of posts, from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy, from Fordist largest factories of 1950 Detroit to post-Fordist economy of flexible accumulation, segmented market, post-Keynesian economics, the rise of a post-material politics in which, as was critiqued, white-collar workers are more concerned with lifestyle choices. And lastly, the shift from modern to postmodern, to a broader skepticism about meta-narratives and modern progress, to a postmodern architecture that rejects universal forms of modernism for an emphasis on context, quirkiness, historicity, playful references to the past. And I think this is really exciting work, linked to the history of capitalism, and that there really could be more work on like, new social movements, or actually looking at the sort of class makeup of the new left, things that that were all brought up here, although it can also be a declension narrative. We don't like neoliberalism, right? And so we're sort of explaining the collapse, and it can become a bit bogged down in terminology, but I think that we can have a discussion. So I just want to end by saying, how is this, let's say, space? And I don't mean to offer a new meta-narrative. It's just to sort of show other possibilities for interpretation. I'm going to use a spatial metaphor. Rather than left or right or whole or fractured, how about thinking of the 1970s as an era of localism, the new localism? That airport protests or this neighborhood movement represented a new politics of scale. That after '68 movements didn't begin to dissipate or become angry, but turned to a politics of local place. That ideas of autonomy, decentralization, do-it-yourselfism, local control, small is beautiful, self-determination, home rule, even different groups from Norman Mailer, and I have a student, graduate student, Pat Nugent's doing this great project on the secession movement in Staten Island, but even words like secession being used by people in the 70s. Maybe almost like a Lefebvrean analysis where you sort of look at the spatial production of politics and also how politics produces space. It's less normative. I was asked to propose a framework. This is so I'll put a target and I'll decide. But localism, thinking about space is less normative. It could be progressive and reactionary. Localism could be place sensitivity, humanization and grassroots participation. It could be provincial, it could be xenophobic, it can be reactionary. It shows sort of strange connections between sometimes environmental protests and anti-busing, things, uncomfortable bedfellows between movements don't make sense. Mayoral candidates like Ray Flynn, Buddy Cianci, people who are hard to figure in these categories. And lastly, I think politics is talking about space, and the spatial term brings an additional set of axes in which we can look at politics. Spatial, rather than left or right, let's say, centralization versus decentralization, pro-growth versus anti-growth, the perspective of the bird's eye view versus the perspective of the walker or the flaneur, debates about public space versus private space, or even quite simply big or small, the politics of smallness in the 70s. So that's lastly, taking the built environment, architecture, planning, and the natural environment as key to political history and key to political movements. So, thank you.
Thank you for that. And that's a very useful concept, too, to take a less normative, more methodological approach. We could have had somebody, actually Gary could have done it among others, to talk about the new state-centered work. And if you center the state and you center policy, you're not necessarily looking for liberalism or conservatism, but have other questions in mind. So running this discussion feels like an impossible task. We have 20 minutes. We have a lot of people in the room who I know have a lot to say. We have 5 panelists. And so what I think I'm going to ask you to do is first ask your question in a way that doesn't take longer than 45 seconds to formulate. Second, at least for the first round, and I'm not sure we'll be able to have more than 2 rounds, ask a question that is one that everybody on the panel can answer as opposed to a question to a single person on the panel. And I'm sure everybody can hang around and talk about specific things after. And third, I think we'll take about 3 or 4 question comments that are all 30 to 45 seconds long, and then we'll give all the panelists a chance to respond to whatever each of them said and whatever you have to say. Yes, sir. Sure.
Okay. I have a very short question. My question is, what is the role of politicians in
That is a perfect question. What is the role of Okay, yes.
Okay, I would say, how does the field of political history examine the impact of transnational social movements such as the anti-apartheid movement, as well as other pan-African connections between the civil rights and African liberation movements on American politics writ large?
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
This is just a quick follow-up on the politicians question, but we had a panel on political history that not only didn't talk very much about politicians, it didn't talk about elections, didn't talk about political parties, and is this a product of this panel? Is this something more broadly going on in political history, and is it a problem?
Jeff.
I will not grandstand on my books, but I wonder about whether the panel thinks that the New Deal is overly naturalized in the whole way we're thinking about this, and that its own fragility in the way it's created in the 30s and the war state of the 40s inherently leaves it so unstable that we've created we're talking about something that we think is stronger than it is.
Okay. Okay, that sounds like a good first round. So we have a question, what about the politicians? And a follow-up, elections and parties and institutions. And then a question about the New Deal and is our orders as stable and coherent as we think? And then a question about transnational social movements as well. So Gary, you went first. Why don't you go first again?
You want me to answer?
You can answer whichever one of those you want.
I get one or I get three?
You can do all of them.
Transnational social movements, let me just, I'm going to be brief. We all have to be brief. But let me just say one of the really interesting turns in the historiography of the civil rights movement has been its international turn. One of the interesting developments in civil rights historiography has been its international turn. And when I teach it to graduate students and undergraduates, I speak of it as an instance of a much broader anti-colonial set of struggles coming out of the disintegration of the empires of World War II. And once you have that perspective, then you want to continue to develop that into South Africa into the 80s and 90s. Politicians and political history, I guess I'm the closest to that. As I declared in the beginning, I'm not interested personally in writing about histories of particular presidents, particular elections, but I do think the ordinary stuff of politics is important. We do have political structures here. In order for meaningful change to happen, at some point, groups that want to change things have to get access to those levers of power. That means elections, and that means brings parties back into it. And I think parties have to be studied not simply as collections of constituencies and authors of policies, but as conduits of money. Which is a way of connecting the political to the economic in really important and interesting ways. So I'm probably the closest to that. Others will have more to answer for than I do along those lines. In terms of Jeff's question, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and I think one has to recognize the fragility in the New Deal order. On the other hand, a set of policies, a set of disciplining characteristics on the force of capitalism, redistributionist policies, taxing policies that were Social Security that were instituted during that time lasted and impacted ideology, lived experience, politics for a very long period of time. And I think that endurance, despite its fragility, needs to be recognized, and I think the question that you and Nick raised is something we're going to have to discuss some more. To what degree is it an exceptional moment in American history, and also to what extent is its endurance conditioned on a condition of permanent war that comes upon America in the 1940s, which I happen to believe that's very important. That's part of what I'm writing now in terms of my book on the state. I want to say one other thing which maybe ties the New Deal and politics together, and that is some elections are more important than others. Sometimes there are greater opportunities for people on the margins to really move toward the center and have a very big impact. And so I would say, and I am interested in identifying those moments and those periods when real change is meaningful, where the structures of power, for one reason or another, happen to be unusually weak, and where those groups who are traditionally, habitually on the margins can make a real bid for power at the center of political life. And I think that distinguishes me. I feel we're perhaps, I feel the presence of an old debate in social history, And I find myself having one spin on one side, and I'm now on the other. So let me come clean about this. This is the agency versus structure. And in England, it took the form of a debate between E.P. Thompson and Perry Anderson. In the U.S., it took the form of a debate between Gutman and Genovese. And it was, to just be crude about this because I've got 30 seconds left, it was a debate between agency and structure. And those in the Gutman-Thompson camps emphasized activity, mobilization. People on the outs are always organizing, things are always happening, and the Anderson Genovese school emphasized structure more, structures of power that limit profoundly opportunities for mobilization. So, for example, with regard to the long civil rights movement, I have some trouble with that. I think there have been moments when there's been an extraordinary possibility of racial change, but those also tend to be limited moments. First Reconstruction, second Reconstruction, it's pretty clear to me we're going to need a third Reconstruction at some point in the next 20 years, and there's conditions that, so I'm interested in understanding when those moments open up, and that is how I think about politics, and that marks my own journey from the agency camp to the structure camp. I think it's informing some of what we're thinking about, and I think it's good to get it out on the table.
Because the microphone is real sensitive, so you can keep it a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, let me take a swing at a couple of the questions. The role of politicians in political history, and let me focus on my comments on local politics. I don't think we've done enough about the diversity of local political situations. I come from a city that has one of the weakest mayoral systems possible, in which, just to give you some sense, at this point, more than 40% of the population cannot participate in any election in Los Angeles County. For a variety of reasons, in which only 15% of the people who were registered to vote actually voted in the last mayoral election. So when one talks about politics or local politics in Los Angeles, one has to kind of come up with very different notions of what does it mean and what's the relationship between those that participate, those that register, and an actual population that lives. And I think it's an incredibly complicated question that we have to really talk about if we're going to talk about the diversity of local situations and politics and its meaning in different spaces. It won't surprise you that I think that one of the important things to sort of gather from this period of 50 years is the rise of celebrity in politics, a symbol, an image, something that's less about what actually gets done and more about what is projected out to a certain group of people that will actually vote. And I think that is something Los Angeles is very well known for, and in fact frames a lot of its political culture. And unfortunately, we've had several presidents from California that I think speak exactly to that issue, probably no better than Ronald Reagan. That born in that political era comes a certain kind of politics on the national level that I think has to be explored. What does it mean to be in an era of more celebrity in politics than anything else? And I just want to put that out as one of the features of bringing politicians back in a different sort of way, at least at the executive level. I found the transnational social movement question, particularly anti-apartheid, very interesting because I think it changes the spaces we have to look at for politics. What does it mean to talk about the relationship between politics in the 80s, for example, that occur on college campuses, certain cities and not others, certain ethnic communities and not others, and that is tied to organizations coming out of London because people in South Africa couldn't literally put faces on a poster, right? You couldn't put Mandela's face on a poster in South Africa. It was banned. So London is organizing a lot of these global operations around the world, including in the US. That's a very interesting way to think about a transnational political movement that was absolutely critical to a lot of the identity formations of the 1980s, right? And that actually leads to significant political change elsewhere, right, in terms of a US context. This is the kind of political history I hope we get in the future, ones that look at these transnational spaces and the connections, essentially, that operate in a obvious political realm that don't always have a necessary effect in a U.S. context, or at least a direct one, but a lot of indirect effects. To me, that's a really excellent question, and the questions of space and new spaces for political movements, I think, is absolutely critical.
New Deal. Is it going to be okay to just admit, Beverly, that personally there's a taste issue with the roles of politicians, parties, elections? That's probably obtains for a lot of people in here without saying that it's therefore not important. It's not the starting point. So I don't know how qualified I am to talk about it. I'll take a stab at it. I'm more convinced by the argument that says that as the franchise expands and as citizenship takes on or is extended to more and more people in its formal sense, including especially electoral politics, that the categories of decision that are then available for political intervention, electoral intervention, shrink. That part of what goes on with the transnationalization of capital and the deterritorialization of economic activity is that it then becomes safer to let more people into formal electoral politics because so many of the important decisions are no longer available to be made there. So that while I don't think anyone can make an argument for turning away from it, is not always the best starting point for the political stories that matter to many of us the most, because the sphere of action has moved. I would not call myself an expert on that, but that is the argument that has worked for me to try to imagine why so many other kinds of actors seem to be so much more central to some of the stories that we care the most about. In terms, that's also an answer, I think, to the transnational story, that just as much as there was an artificial division among so many of the things that we all write about, there's an artificial suppression of the international story that is the real context for so much of American political tradition that was an artifact of the Cold War that made it dangerous to really own up to how genuinely transnational American politics and American populations were at virtually every point. And Robin Kelly's argument here so welcome to my world when you discover transnational politics post-1989, I think is an important warning that we not take the Cold War era's self-representation seriously, that in fact politics have been transnational in this country at virtually every point. And it is incredibly heartening to see one of the outflowings of post-colonial impact in American history and American studies is a return of that story, of that framework for understanding virtually any story that we could also analyze as a domestic political story, including the New Deal, which is part of why I'm hesitant to let go of it once it's put back in its international context as an expression of an international moment, rather than just a admittedly quite fragile domestic one.
So in terms of the role of politicians in electoral politics and political parties, I think this is an area that is also it wasn't represented on the panel, but it's also experiencing a lot of new kinds of work. I'm thinking of course, all the stuff on conservative grassroots mobilization and the shift in the Republican Party. I'm thinking of Jonathan Bell on the Democratic Party in California, and the bringing social history into what parties mean for people on the ground. So I think that's a really important issue. Also looking at the way that parties and policy debates, the role of the framing and the rhetoric of those, like Hosang's book on California. It's all in California. So I do think that's an area we need more attention to. I think that we need to really look at political parties as sites of contest, just like the larger political realm is a site of contest. You know, there's work now on contest over civil rights obviously within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party. Certainly debates over feminism and gender and sexual politics in both parties. And that sort of brings me to this notion of agency versus structure. And I think I think maybe that's another dichotomy that is problematic, right? Structure is created out of contest. So the winners win not because of some self-evident reality like the market or whatever it might be, but because some people win over other people in a struggle. So I think that's where, if I sounded as if I was privileging agency and giving that too much power, that's what I'm trying to get at, that statecraft policy outcomes, all of these are a result of contest. So not to romanticize agency. And that Bethany made a point that I wanted to make too, that, I mean, one of these paradoxes of the so-called fall of the New Deal order, this late 20th century, is that at the very moment we see an expansion of political engagement and participation, we see a tremendous increase in economic inequality. And why is that? And I think Bethany, that's one really important factor, is that out of this contest, fewer decisions are available for people on the ground and voters to participate in. So power, who has the power to shape those structures?
Just to answer about the transnational turn, there's interesting work on coming both from Europe and the United States on the global 1968, drawing first on the global civil rights movement, but then also the global anti-war movement, Vietnam, anti-Vietnam activism in Europe. There's also in urban history interesting transnational politics of urban redevelopment. Chris Clemick's book about the rise and fall of urban renewal in Canada, Europe, and the United States. Someone like Nancy Kwok, who's looking at public housing policy in Singapore and in the United States and in the U.S. So interesting in urban history, a lot of interesting stuff in the transnational context. And I was just thinking of also people who are beginning to look at things like the Ford Foundation. Daniel Immerwahl has an interesting work about international development and urban development in domestic sphere. So
there's so much to say. We're almost out of time. I think I'll give a plug for some of the new work on the social politics of the state and the agency structure question. I'm glad you brought it up. Bruce Schulman and I talked about whether this should be political history since 1945 or just political history. There's so much great stuff coming out of the progressive era about Peggy Pascoe and county clerks and Nyan Shaw and May Nye and the way that bureaucratic officials and the way the border is policed, the way the FHA didn't redline neighborhoods. Individual bankers drove around and looked out their window and looked at neighborhoods and then put them on the maps. And these kind of encounters, and to think about the agency of bureaucrats and the agency of policymakers in the state is just one of many ways that we can go methodologically as well as conceptually. And I hate to say it, but we're out of time. So I thought I'd ask the panelists to each define neoliberalism in 5 words. I'd like to thank the panelists and thank all of you for coming as well.